Right, so this video is about historical linguistics. I'll be going over the different topics that we'll be looking at in Linguistics 102 for this. So we start with the reminder that we learned right at the beginning of our linguistics studies that all aspects of language change over time. The pronunciation, the way we put words together, syntax, vocabulary, meanings, it all changes. Uh, Now, what makes this a tractable thing, something we can study systematically, is that that change doesn't tend to just affect a single pronunciation or a single sentence structure, but it's systematic, right? All pronunciations containing a particular sound or sound in a particular context will change together. All sentences of a particular type will come to take a different form, a different word order, for example. And we understand now some of the key drivers of language change, the things that cause those systematic shifts. Things like articulatory simplification. We change pronunciations so that they're easier to pronounce. Um, Spelling pronunciation. So when we have a writing system, the structure of that writing system will feed back into the spoken language in interesting ways. Analogy, where there's exceptions, sometimes they'll be kind of washed out by analogy with more regular forms. Reanalysis, uh, language contact, lots of different things that can cause changes in a language. And having done that broader overview of what can change, we then go through uh, the various different types of change. So looking at changes in sounds, which are often phonetically conditioned, right? The change is triggered by a particular sequence or by, like I said, articulatory simplification. Maybe a particular sound is getting shifted. Um, Sequential changes like assimilation, uh, different types of assimilation, place assimilation, manner assimilation, palatalization, affrication, and so on. Dissimilation, which is often to make the sounds more distinct so we can hear what's going on a bit better. Uh, Epenthesis or insertion, deletion, metathesis. Deletion comes along with a whole suite of different forms of weakening. Um, Consonant strengthening in certain aspects, certain conditions, certain environments, uh, and so on. So a lot of different types of sound change that can happen, and we look at some of the reasons that they can happen in the textbook. One important concept to get hold of here is that the sounds can change without really dramatically changing the structure of the phonology, but sometimes the phonology changes too. We'll have two sounds that get merged, right? They start to be pronounced the same, such that the new generation speaking the language doesn't have a phonemic distinction where earlier generations did. You can do the reverse, where you start with one sound, but for various reasons it becomes split. So you end up with two phonemes where there was once one. And these are uh, interesting, an interesting example of little sound changes, subtle changes in pronunciation building up into something more widespread across the grammar. After sound change, we look at morphological change. So how do we add and remove affixes, for example, regularize things, reanalyze forms, the morphological structure of a word or unit. So some interesting ways that languages can change their morphological structure, even so far as moving from being, say, an analytic language that with very little affixation to a synthetic language with a lot of affixation, or the other way. After morphology, we look at syntax. So the most obvious thing is, we have the subject, object, and verb that can go in different orders, and that order can change. But there's also other things like, how to form questions. In English, there's a word order aspect there. In other languages, it's adding a question word, for example, or some combination of that. So a lot of things that can happen to the syntactic structures that can change over time. Lexical and semantic change. So when we look at the vocabulary, new words being added, old words being lost, the meanings of existing words moving, drifting, expanding, contracting, that sort of thing. And then having looked at changes in different parts of the grammar like that, we then look at the spread of change. And there's sort of two different dimensions we can think of change spreading in. One is an innovation may happen on a particular word and then spread, whether it's a change in pronunciation or a change in morphological structure, whatever, it can spread throughout the language, right? Um, so perhaps there's an irregular form that then becomes more and more regularized because that alternation expands to more and more words in the language. So you get this kind of lexical diffusion that spreads out, just like a drop of color in a bowl of water spreading out slowly over time. And the other kind of spread that we look at is spread through through a population. So one person may do something new because they're unusual in one way or another, and then their change may be adopted by the people around them, and then the people around them, and slowly spread throughout the population that speaks the language. So we can talk about spread across the different parts of the language and spread across the population of speakers using the language. And then a lot of all of this sort of comes out of the study of languages and people who study languages and how they change and trying to reconstruct the older versions of languages. So the job of discovering the proto-language, the language that came before that gave us, for example, English and Dutch and German and other Germanic languages, or that gave us French and Italian and the other languages that derive from Latin, for example. Okay, so language reconstruction, what what approaches, what techniques can we use for that? How can we form some idea of what the earlier language sounded like, even if we have no written record of it? There's a lot of really powerful tools for doing that, and we see a lot of examples mainly from Indo-European in the textbook that kind of show us how that process can work. One of the advantages of Indo-European is that the current languages, many of their sort of next generation back predecessor languages were also written down, so we can check our sound analysis against the written forms to see uh, how how sound it is, how robust the analysis and the techniques are. Right, and that's it. So we go from talking about the reality of language change and its systematicity, and we go through various details of how different parts of a language can change, and we end up at the end of the chapter looking at how it is that we discover these things, how we study them. So that's historical linguistics in a nutshell. That's all for now.